We are going to jump in starting now. I've got the incredible Reed Galen here with us today on the Treason Substack. Many of you know Reed as one of the co-founders of the Lincoln Project. And before that, a lifelong Republican operative, thought leader, and pro-democracy champion since the very beginning. But we need those now more than ever. And Reed, I wanted to just jump straight in and ask you as people join us about the news today, because you and I have been having these conversations for years about what could happen to our country in a second term of Donald Trump. And I'll be honest with you, man, what we're seeing in Washington, D.C. is really the start of the thing I feared the most, which is a president abusing his powers, abusing his commander-in-chief title overseeing the United States military to start to project power into American cities. And we're seeing that happen. I mean, you and I both know Washington extremely well. There were news reports last night out of D.C. that they have set up these military and police checkpoints in neighborhoods that you and I are both very familiar with, that are peaceful neighborhoods, largely peaceful neighborhoods that are now places where if you pass through, you got to stop at the checkpoint. This is something I really did never imagine we would see in the United States of America until the past few years. I want to get your take on that. Just the idea that there are now military checkpoints in the nation's capital.
Well, remember the last time there were military checkpoints in the nation's capital, it was because of January 6th, 2021, and in the lead up to then President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration, because they were concerned maybe these people would take another shot at it. To your point, yeah, I mean, the checkpoints are being set up in Northwest around monuments. And those are reminders both to the residents who I think typically vote 90% against the Republican presidential nominee, and to the people going to the Lincoln Memorial, right? Just like this is what the world looks like. And, people maybe they're a little bit freaked out. Maybe they haven't heard all the news. But seeing guys and gals in fatigues, carrying M16s, I think that, Lincoln, if he could rest his head in his hand in his big chair up there in the marble, he'd probably be beside himself. And now my fear is that they will actually use Abraham Lincoln to say, well, he suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War because there was an insurrection, it was a national emergency, and we feel like we're going to do the same. And then let me also say about the National Guardsmen and women, they have real lives, they have real jobs. And so they're being taken away from their families, they're being taken away from their offices or their work sites, wherever it is. And so this has a spiderweb effect from the very top, is what you're talking about, is instilling fear and reminding people who is in charge. And I think a lot of that, there is the local impact of people not coming to Washington because they're scared, they don't know what's going on. And then I think there's also the piece of this, which is we should not forget that this is an ultimate distraction, right? This is a guy who's, his numbers are falling. His own base is very uncertain and upset with him because of all of this Jeffrey Epstein ugliness. And so to your point, like distraction and, dispossession of civil rights is a hallmark of authoritarian regimes. We've seen it throughout history, and now we're just starting to see it now. I feel like, just one last thing, Miles, is that I feel like there was a really, really fast start to this kind of stuff. I feel like there was a lull for a couple of months, and now it's picked up speed again.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I'm glad you mentioned the hallmarks throughout history and recent history as well. I mean, we've seen things like this play out in Istanbul, in Budapest, of course, in Moscow, and in places like Hong Kong, where the Chinese have exerted power. But we've never seen those same patterns here on our own soil. And if we stick with that for a moment, and we try to give people a forecast of where this could go, because, look, with a lot of things, Donald Trump could decide, that this just wasn't worth it, and they weren't getting the PR that they wanted off of military deployments. He could pull them back. I find that actually to be very unlikely. I think we should expect long-term military deployments on U.S. soil through the rest of the Trump presidency. But if we want to forecast where this could go, and if you do look at those foreign capitals, a lot of those places became test beds for a police state in those countries. And I say test beds because they are literally that in those places. In the early days of Vladimir Putin coming into power, They tested out different raids in Moscow, whether it was on nonprofit organizations or the households of dissidents or setting up different checkpoints, experimenting with technology to monitor citizens. We've seen that taken to a whole new level in China. And this is the type of thing that now, by directly controlling local police forces and augmenting them with the military, the president does have the ability to create that sort of surveillance sandbox in the nation's capital. And I don't say this, as a pipe-hitting conspiracy theorist. I mean, I say this as someone who spent most of his career in Homeland Security, in
Right.
national
National
security,
security. Right.
and also working under a president who wanted to do those things. So again, I would say to anyone who just vocalized what I just did, I would tell them they were crazy if either of those two conditions, weren't true. If there wasn't a president willing to do these things, and if he hadn't demonstrated the proclivity in the past. And yet here we have Donald Trump, who's wanted to weaponize the spy powers of the United States government, and he has taken over effectively force in a U.S. city. Should Americans be thinking about it in those terms? Should we be thinking about this like 1984? Or Reed, is that too hyperbolic? Are people like me, hyperventilating and making those suggestions that this is the direction it could go?
I mean, I think you're 100% right that it's the direction that we should go. But I think at the very end there, you just brought in, I think, the key piece of this, which is the people. And you and I actually, this came about because you and I were texting back and forth. And most Americans, do not live in, I mean, many Americans live, tens of millions of Americans live in urban areas, but more people live in the suburbs or the exurbs, and they are not likely to be affected by this in their daily lives.
Yeah.
And for me, and again, going back to what history has taught us, is that until and unless people start to see this stuff on their doorsteps, it's hard for them to internalize. They can see it, but they don't feel it. And I think there's a bigger part of this too, which is if you talk about a lot of those places you saw, which is the work of the test bed is done by the time the brand new ICE officer shows up on your doorstep, because the
Mhm.
people are already conditioned to say, I don't want anything to do with that. Right. I don't know what's going on. I just want to live my life. I want to go to Home Depot on Sunday. I want to work on my garden. I want to watch football. Right. And so the bad guys have a very significant built-in advantage, which is we as humans want to do what is the easiest and least dangerous thing for us. We are hardwired for that, right? Avoid
Mhm.
danger, right? And if danger is showing up in places you didn't expect it, you're not likely to go there. So I'd be, interested. I'm no economist, but interested to see what happens to the economies of places where people are no longer feeling comfortable to go out, right? If you're not comfortable, if you live on whatever it is, let's say Rhode Island Avenue in Northwest, but you've got to cross a checkpoint at 14th and U to go to dinner. Are you going to do that? The answer could be no, just like it's not worth it. Right. And then we've also seen something to bring in another factor of this, which is we saw in the spring that, the CBP was pulling over people as they were coming back in through international checkpoints into American airports, right? Americans. And which meant that at some point they knew those people were on airplanes. There's a list somewhere, right? I hate to say that you're probably much higher on that list than I am, but there is a list somewhere and it probably grows on a daily basis. And when do you start to say, okay, well, now I got Miles and his wife going to dinner. All right. Well, we've already called him out publicly as a danger to national security. And now we picked him up going to the neighborhood Italian restaurant, right? And so to your point, I could make this as ugly as we want. And I think it will take time, but one last thing is I did a lot of work, and you might have participated too, with the Brennan Center last year,
Yeah.
looking at what another Trump term would look like. And the Brennan Center is a brilliant organization. They do the right work for the right reasons. And the one thing that I was sitting next to a gentleman who'd been with the U.S. Marshal Service for decades is the Marshal Service can deputize literally anyone they want.
Mhm.
And they often do it with local and state law enforcement on fugitives or extraditions or whatever that is. So he's like, you don't even need the military. You could just go deputize anybody you wanted to. And you probably have plenty of guys who are already armed, right? Who already have the weapons to go say, okay, yeah, just go stand over on that corner and scare the hell out of people. And I think that that's where, call it the boiling frog, call it the Again, I don't know what's going on, but I don't want a part of it. But the instinct for average, and I hate the word average, but individual Americans is going to be to take a step back from this kind of stuff, not say it's wrong. And I don't blame them for it. I think that's human nature.
I'm glad, Reed, you mentioned the exercises you and I were a part of that the Brennan Center did, and outstanding organization. And they were very, very thoughtful in trying to get a bipartisan group of people, Democrats and Republicans, together to think through what might happen in a second Trump administration and some of the things that would challenge the rule of law. And I've told people this story before, but I'll repeat it in much shorter fashion, which is in one of those exercises, I was playing the role of Secretary of Homeland Security. And we kicked off at the sort of the beginning of the Donald Trump administration, the second administration. And one of the early things I did in that exercise was go start working with the military in the exercise to deploy troops into US cities to crack down on immigration. And I won't say who, but a great friend of ours, a great friend of the pro-democracy movement, sort of reached out virtually during the exercise and said, hey, why don't you play this a little bit more straight? Let's be realistic. Trump's not going to start deploying troops in the first few months of his presidency. And I said, I respectfully disagree. I think we're going to see this, and it's going to get real bad real fast. And sure enough, we have seen that happen. But I bring that up because there was a second phase in that war game that we did where I forecast in that position of Secretary of Homeland Security that they might move toward the thing you just mentioned, Reed, which is quasi vigilante justice, which again sounds like something out of a bad fiction novel. And yet, when I was at the Department of Homeland Security, there were conversations during the first Trump administration about deputizing militia groups in the United States and giving them federal law enforcement powers. And listeners would be right to say that can't possibly be a real thing. That's not something that the administration could do. Well, false. There's actually multiple legal authorities that the president of the United States has where he would be able to deputize militia groups to go enforce federal law. It's something that the Trump administration kicked around in back rooms. It's something I'm worried about becomes another phase of this. Yes, they have hundreds of thousands, millions of U.S. forces they could deploy, but there are scenarios where you could imagine that the Trump administration might be interested in a more pliable force. And that means they could go to groups like the Proud Boys and deputize them to go enforce something like immigration law. I really worry about that because then we're not only talking about forces directly accountable to the president of the United States, but forces that are not trained to respect the rule of law. And then we're just one hop, skip, and a jump away from true vigilantism. And that's where things can really spiral. And the fact that we're even talking about that as plausible is alarming to me. And I wonder, Reed, if we start to head down that path, where are the brakes? Who hits the brakes and how do the people hit the brakes if that starts to happen?
Well, it's hard because remember that this stuff isn't occurring in a vacuum, right? There is the White House, there's the entire federal government, there are the military and law enforcement organs, and let's be very clear. The military often does a terrible job at policing. It's not their job. They don't like doing it. I was watching an old clip yesterday from Battlestar Galactica, of all things, where he's like, the police are supposed to protect and serve the people. The military are supposed to go after an objective. And when you ask the police or when you ask the military to make the populace their objective, bad things often happen. But again, I think that the brakes are very difficult to come upon. I think that this is a thin reed to hold on to. The thing that we do have going for us is that Trump himself, and compared to the folks that you worked with and I worked with many years ago, there's a lot of incompetence involved here, right? At the top. And because there's a lot of incompetence, I'm hoping that there are still people in the middle, in the wiring of all of this stuff, who can try and slow things up. I think that there's also a need for, we should go out to we should communicate to guard members on social media. You don't have, if somebody gives you an illegal order, you are not at all bound to follow that order, right? If somebody says you should go shoot a civilian, you do not have to shoot that civilian. I could also make one. A friend of mine suggested this yesterday. How about Governor Newsom and Governor Hochul and Governor Pritzker? Why don't they deploy the guard on their own and go protect federal buildings? right? Like, we're protecting federal buildings. Do I think that's a great idea? I don't know. Do I think it ups the ante of a conflict? It might. But I'll tell you this, is that we are we are at a disadvantage. We should not deny that. Um, and I think until and unless otherwise normal Americans start to say no, and they're not going to have a lot of ways to do that. They can reach out to their elected officials, but if they're Republicans, we know how far behind Trump they are. They're not going to do any of this stuff. And so, what I would say is that you really have to look after yourselves, your families, your communities. You have to call this stuff out. Remember back in the old DHS days, see something, say something, right? If you see something, say something. I think that the reason why Trump backed off after Los Angeles was because he really didn't like seeing all that. He didn't
Mhm.
really like seeing cops beating people up. Now, you might have a different perspective, but it seems to me that he backed away a little bit, and then you get like Stephen Miller, who gets him one on one, and then he lights the fires again. But I think that if we get to a point where military or law enforcement personnel are asking to load their weapons with live ammunition, right? I think that that's going to create a real crisis of conscience, I hope, within our law enforcement and our military agencies.
Well, so I'm looking at the comments here, and Kat Crowder asked a question about whether, U.S. forces who are given illegal orders should have to comply with those orders. Isn't it their oath to defend the Constitution and to uphold the law? And aren't they obligated to refuse an illegal order? And I'd be interested in your perspective on this, Reed. I mean, my immediate reaction to that is, well, yes, of course, that's what they're supposed to do. But here's the scary thing about it is, Trump has already talked to folks in the past who have expressed resistance to executing illegal orders, and he's dangled pardons out there for them to say, look, I want you to go forward with this, and if you get in trouble, I'll pardon you. And that's what's really, I think, to me, worrisome about this next phase we could go into is I talked about this the other week with a couple of folks. We have not yet seen the president use the full scope of the pardon power, and it's something that could be coming. And again, I don't say these things in the
Right.
abstract. I mean, little old me was on the receiving end of a hypothetical presidential pardon if I was to carry out illegal activity at the
Right.
Department of Homeland Security. It was mind blowing to me to be in a conversation with the president like that, where he's dangling a pardon possibility to do something illegal at the border. And I strongly suspect, he will do that again in some form or fashion. Certainly at the end of this administration, there will be so many officials who served under him who executed orders that the courts have already determined are illegal or unconstitutional that he'll want to pardon. But it's something he could do proactively for people
Sure.
he's trying to induce to go do things that are illegal. But question to you, Reed, would be, does that guardrail hold of, frontline defenders upholding their oath instead of carrying out the orders of a single man?
Again, this is my opinion. I think that you have a lot better chance of that happening with active duty military or activated guard. Um,
Mhm.
to your point, the people I worry about, just look what happened when Trump basically gave the green light to local police forces in 2020 and said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And I think, to me, that was, I respect law enforcement, but I also have a great deal of concern that we should not shy away from that. If given carte blanche to go after demonstrators, again, not just here in the U.S., but historically we have seen that they will do that. But to your point, like those 180,000 ICE agents, right, and those militias, those are the people that really concern me because they're joining up out of ideology. They're not joining up out of they might call it service, they might call it duty. They're doing it because he asked them to. They're doing
Yeah.
it because like they don't like those people. They think that we need more law and order, and those are the people that concern me. I think that if a field grade officer, a company grade officer is told to commit an illegal act, I have a really hard time believing that their first answer is salute and march forward, right? And
Yeah.
I don't get the sense that, yeah, even if the average rifleman is maybe to the right of where I am politically, that their first thought is, yeah, they told me to pull the trigger on that lady over on the corner. I hope against hope that's not what's going to happen. And so it's those second and third tier options that you described that I think are very real that concern me the most. And then let's just put it this way. If Donald Trump does decide he wants to leave office, like he will have to start pardoning people like in January of 28. It's going to take him so long. Right. But you know
Mhm.
as well as I do that everybody's working for him right now is assuming that a pardon is coming their way.
Yeah,
Right.
for sure.
Because whatever it is they've done, either they will have broken a law that's on the books and not enforced, or a judge told them not to do it and they did it anyway. Right. So to
Mhm.
your point, I think we're going to see a mass pardon effort. And as you saw, like he's replaced all the people that have any level of scruple, conscience, or competence. They'll do whatever he tells them to do. And I don't see anybody standing up inside there. And I've got friends like you do. I've got friends on the inside, and I'm like, "What are you guys doing?" No answer.
Yeah,
Crickets. Right. I've got
yeah.
friends who work, in government, in politics, going, "What are you guys doing?" Crickets. Right. And I'll say this without any grace: like they took their 30 pieces of silver a long time ago. Right.
Yeah.
I'm not counting on them anymore.
Well, Reed, I want to, on the back end of this, take us back to something that you opened with, which was that the way that this works, the way that leaders with autocratic tendencies are successful, is that by and large, the population doesn't see their lives change overnight. I mean, autocracy and dictatorship are big, scary words. And when you hear those words, you imagine that every day there's a troop knocking at your door and you can't go out in the streets anywhere and there's just a clampdown on everyday life. That's not what it looks like. And that's not what it looks like in the modern world. And Rachel Maddow mentioned this the other week. She opened her show with this really powerful segment talking about how life can feel very normal as this all happens. And I'm obviously on the road right now and visiting some family members. And last night I was having this exact thought walking into a barbecue place and thinking, life feels very normal here. I opened the door, I was greeted by friends, I had great conversations. Things just were normal. And yet this is all still happening in our country. And I had someone last night say to me, Miles, with all due respect, what if no one gives a shit if people like you are put in handcuffs and hauled off to jail? I mean, that's a scary thing to see, but
Right.
how does that affect them? How do we engage with people and communicate it? And one of the things I said back, Reed, and I'd love your take on this, is I flip it. I say, don't focus on the elites. The president's ongoing revenge campaign, which has no precedent in American history,
Right.
affects every single aspect of our lives. Whether it's the US cities where checkpoints are slowly being set up or not, there are less dramatic but very pervasive examples. The revenge he's taking out against universities is affecting the schools your children will go to. The political appointees he's putting in charge of programs like student loan programs can be politicized. The efforts that they're undertaking to try to use tax data at the IRS could start to affect every American. Their intimidation of the legal system could make it harder for you to get legal defenses if you end up doing something or your business does something contrary to one of the president's policies. If there's a tornado or a hurricane in your neighborhood, the president has decided to bring FEMA aid under his control and personal decision making. So if you live in a blue state, you might not get that aid. And you
Right.
could go all the way to your actual right to vote, which there's a lot of concern that the administration is going to make it harder for people, especially in blue states and localities, to go exercise their fundamental democratic rights. I mean, this is serious. It's pervasive. It's not just elites or people who've crossed Donald Trump the wrong way. His revenge campaign is warping every aspect of American life. Your
Right.
thoughts on that?
So first thing, I watched. It's one of my favorite movies, and I haven't watched in a while. But I watched All the President's Men with my 15-year-old daughter the other night, and
Great film.
the 1970s sensibilities that she couldn't understand, notwithstanding, all that stuff looks so quaint in comparison, right? But there's a scene where Jason Robards, who's brilliant as Ben Bradley, is standing in his front yard in his bathrobe. And he said, "You know what the Gallup poll just said? 50% of people never heard of Watergate. No one gives a shit." Right? He wasn't wrong then, and you're not wrong now. So again, there's that very natural human reaction to deny, deny, deny. It's not me. It's not me. It's not going to get to me. And by the time it does, as we talked about a little bit earlier, get to you, it's too late. I think the other part too
Yeah.
is you talked about, like, everyone knows, and this goes back to, some of our friends who have, are from the Soviet Union or worked in Eastern Europe. Like, everybody knows he's lying, right? Everybody knows. Like, everybody knew that the Soviet government was lying to them. It was just part of accepted reality. But you didn't really talk about it because what was the trouble worth, right? Do I really need the trouble? No, I don't need the trouble. And again, that's one of those pieces where the normalcy is intoxicating. And because, oh, see, nothing, it's not that bad. Is there something, we're 7 months into his presidency, is there something I couldn't do on January 19th, or I could do on January 19th that I can't do today, right? And for some people, maybe even the majority of Americans, that answer is, I'm fine. Nothing's really changed that much. But to your point, we also need to talk about how we communicate these things, which is, if you're going to say, look what he's doing to Harvard, let's be candid. A lot of people are going to be like, Harvard doesn't need my pity. Harvard doesn't need my help. But what those institutions need to do, first, is not give in. But the second thing is say, we use this money that taxpayers pay for because it is going to make sure that your wife doesn't have this disease, your baby survives this birth defect, your aging parent doesn't have this form of dementia. We have to start connecting why these things matter to actual humans' lives, right?
Hmm.
Because until and unless you do that, it doesn't make sense. And let me just say this, going back to the Brennan Center thing, I was, I don't know, blessed or cursed to play like the Steve Bannon role a couple of times. And they told me I
You're
was only
great at
allowed,
it.
I guess so, but I was only allowed to tweet every 5 minutes. Because every time I tweeted, right, everything got all mixed up. And they're like, you're making it too hard for the game to go on. I said, but that's the point, right?
Yep.
Which is Bannon and Tucker and all the people in the White House and all the people in the right wing, like, they never stop. As you know, they never stop. And so, like, we're not going to match that. They spent 40 or 50 years building up that infrastructure.
Yep.
So if you're going to defend Harvard or higher education for a country in which 68% of people don't go to college, then you have to illustrate, not explain. You don't want to talk down. That's not going to get you. That's how we got where we are. You have to illustrate why it matters. You have to illustrate that there are people who go to work every day to work on a life-saving drug that is going to save you or a family member or somebody that, was not going to live if this work hadn't been done. And I think that that's the kind of stuff you have to start connecting these things. You also, again, you mentioned FEMA. Look, I worked at FEMA. Right. I was in New Orleans the day 24 hours after Katrina made landfall, right? Like, I've seen failure at every level of government. That's now we're not even going to have failure. We're going to have, what's the word I'm looking for? Abandonment at every level of government. Right. You talk about voting in 2026. Here's how it goes. It's not that they tell people you can't vote. Right. Here's what they're going to do. And I don't know if it passed in this last bill or they're going to get it done in the coming years, that they're just not going to provide the grants to counties and localities to
Yep.
actually run the elections efficiently. So now,
Yep.
instead of having 8 precincts, you're going to have 3 precincts. We're going to have to shrink the hours because we can't hire the part-time workers. It's going to take longer to count the votes and tabulate the votes. What do you think they're going to say if it takes 2 days to tabulate the votes? What are they doing in there? Right? Remember what they
Yep.
did in Atlanta? Remember how they stole it from him back then? And so all of this stuff is done under the auspices of the government or in the contract and the context of democratically elected people. And we know that's unfortunately the sort of poison pill built into democracy, which is, if you want to destroy it from the inside, that's a much easier way to do it.
Yep. Well, look, we're at the half hour. We have to jump. I want to encourage everyone. Reed, that was a powerful note to end us on. Followers of Treason, if you're not following Reed Galen, this is one of the democracy champions out there. Reed, I admire you, my friend. I look up to you. I'm
Oh,
really grateful you were able to join us today. Seriously, thank you.
no, thanks, Miles. Thanks for having me. Travel safe. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.